The colony ship Vithara had been in orbit for 11 days before anyone on the ground understood what it actually was. That was the part Sergeant Mara Voss kept coming back to. 11 days. Long enough for the Veth to land their seed modules in the Nevada basin, grow the habitat structures up from the alkaline dirt, like something between a coral reef and a suburb. Pipe in filtered air and calibrated light, and even a low hum that the early xenolinguistics team said was meant to be soothing. Long enough for the UN to send in its first contact delegation, and for the Veth to receive them with what looked, if you squinted and tried very hard, courtesy. Long enough for the global news cycle to cycle through terror, wonder, cautious hope, and back to wonder again. 11 days. And on the 12th, a man named Hector Ruiz walked out of the habitat dome with his eyes rolled back and his hands making shapes that didn't respond to any emotion a living human body should be capable of. And by the time the medical team reached him, the chip they found embedded at the base of his skull had already begun to dissolve. Mara had been in the field at Firebase Kessler when the report came in. She'd read it 3 times, sitting on the hood of a stalled Humvee in the red afternoon, the Nevada heat pressing down on her like a thumb. She'd thought, there it is. That's the thing nobody wants to say yet. She said it anyway, in the debrief that evening, and the room went very quiet. They came to farm us. Her commander, Colonel Harlan Osi, was a precise man who had built his career on precision, which meant he did not like Mara's theory sup. Not because it was wrong. He didn't like it because the moment he accepted it, precision stopped being useful and gut instinct started. And Harlan Osi's gut instinct had never been tested against anything like this. The chip, Mara said, spreading the medical report across the briefing table. It's not communications hardware. The Xenotech team ran it twice. It's a receiver transmitter, but it's not pointing up. She tapped the diagram. It points inward. It maps neural pathways, specifically the ones associated with acute stress response, fear, grief, anticipatory dread. The Veth aren't studying us, sir. They are harvesting us. Harvesting what exactly? Emotional output, neurochemical signatures. Whatever we generate when we're terrified. She met his eyes. Hector Ruiz was a dying man, stage 4 pancreatic. The Veth medical team offered him a treatment and he took it, because he was desperate and dying and they looked helpful. She folded her hands on the table. The chip didn't treat him, it used him, and when he generated enough, whatever enough is for them, it finished and dissolved, and he walked out of there with his nervous system rewired. Osi was quiet for a long moment. How many people went to the Veth for medical treatment? Mara already had that number. 231 since day 3. Another silence. Get me Dr. Elias Carr, Osi said finally. What's inside that habitat? It's him. Mara had known Elias Carr for 4 years, which was long enough to understand 2 things about him. He was the best xenobiologist on the planet, and he had agreed to take a position inside the Veth habitat before the chip discovery, because he genuinely believed the Veth were benign. The news hit him the way Mara had expected it to hit him. Not with shock, but with a very still, very controlled kind of grief, like a man watching a house he loved burn from across a street he couldn't cross. She drove out to his field station herself, 'cause some conversation shouldn't happen over a radio. He was sitting outside his tent with a mug of coffee going cold in his hands when she pulled up. Mid-40s, deep-set eyes that always looked like they were calculating something, particular brand of exhaustion that only researchers who'd been sleeping 4 hours a night for a month wore. He had a habit of humming when he was thinking. Something old. Something she could never quite place. He was doing it when she parked. He stopped when he saw her face. Show me, he said. She showed him. He read the report without speaking, read it again, set it down on his knee, and looked out at the habitat dome in the distance, rising white and serene against the mountain ridgeline, its surface catching the late light in a way that made it look almost beautiful. They built it to look like everything we want, he said. Walkable, human scale, clean air, green space, all within reach. A place where everything you need is right there. They built it to make us comfortable enough to come inside. Yes. He took a sip of cold coffee. And the ones who didn't come voluntarily, the sick ones who needed them. He stopped. 231 people, Elias. He set the mug down. She watched him do it. Watched him find something under the grief, something steady and hard and hot. She'd seen that face before once, at a field station in Mali, when 3 of their team had gone missing, and Elias had walked back into a collapsing cave system with a flashlight and a bad ankle because he decided that was what needed doing. "I'm still inside," he said. "My access codes still work. I have a lab in the secondary ring. I know. If I can get to the central processor array, Elias. If I can map the signal chain from the chips back to the collection node, we can figure out what they're storing it in. And if we know that, Elias..." She looked at him straight. "I'm not here to stop you. I'm here to come with you." He went quiet. Then the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one. He picked up the mug again. "You'll need a cover," he said. "Have one. New linguistics posting. Fresh transfer." She held up the credentials, already forged, already cleared through. Channels OC had opened quietly and without documentation. "I report to a VETH administrator designated Sector Voice Ulthran. I have an orientation session in 4 hours." He looked at the credentials. Tit at her. "You've been planning this since before you drove out here." "Since before I read the report the second time." He hummed that tune again, just a few bars, almost under his breath. She still couldn't place it. "My mother used to sing something like that," she said. He looked surprised. "It was my mother's too. I don't even know what it's called. It shows up when I'm working through something hard." She didn't say anything to that. "Some things you didn't need to." 4 hours, he said. Stood up. The habitat's interior was worse than the exterior promised and better than Mara had feared, which was its own kind of horror. The light was calibrated to mimic late afternoon in autumn. Golden, low-angled, the kind that made everything look like it was worth remembering. The structures were human scale, with doorways sized for human bodies and furniture proportioned for human comfort. The Veth themselves were tall and triple-jointed, and moved with a fluid quality that made her hindbrain want to categorize them as wrong, but they had clearly studied enough human behavior to know not to crowd, not to loom. To keep their voices in registers that didn't trigger alarm. They were good at the shape of hospitality. They were not good at the content of it. Mara noticed the tells within the first hour. The way the Veth medical staff lingered near patients who were visibly distressed. Not moving to help, just staying close. The way you'd linger near a campfire. The slight change in posture when a human cried or raised their voice in fear. The faint subsonic hum, beneath the soothing ambient tone, that she felt in her molars when she passed certain corridors. She noted it all and kept her face neutral and smiled at Sector Voice Ulthran when the administrator asked how she was finding the facility. "It's remarkable," she said. "Everything you need in one place." Ulthran's sensory clusters shifted in a way that might have been satisfaction. Elias was 3 corridors over, accessing a terminal he'd mapped during his legitimate research weeks, running the signal trace they'd planned in the car on the way in. He had 40 minutes before his supposed lab session. They had a word for if anything went wrong. A bird call, casual, something you could hear down a corridor, and she'd been cycling through response. Protocols in the back of her mind ever since they'd walked through the gate. The call didn't come. What came instead, at the 22-minute mark, was a sound she had not prepared for. It started in the north wing, a long, low structural groan, like a building settling, except the Veth didn't build anything that settled. Then shouting, human voices, 2 or 3, particular pitch of people discovering something they could not process. Then a sound that wasn't a sound, that she felt in the soles of her feet and the bridge of her nose. And then the floor in the corridor ahead of her opened. Not crumbled, not collapsed, opened like a mouth. The black substance that came up through it was not liquid and not gas and not solid but moved like all 3, simultaneously, and it reached for the nearest warm body with what she could only describe as intention. The nearest warm body was a technician named Davies who had been walking toward the cafeteria with a sandwich, and he had time to say what the before the blackness took him by the ankle, and Davies was gone. The floor sealed. Mara stood very still and thought, with a clarity she would later recognize as the productive edge of terror. That is what the chips are for. That is the retrieval mechanism. She ran. She found Elias 3 minutes later, which felt like 30. He had abandoned the terminal and was flattened against a service corridor wall, with a look on his face that was the worst thing she'd seen in a day, full of terrible things, because it wasn't fear. Fear she could work with. It was the expression of a man who had just seen something he'd spent, his life believing in turn inside out. "The collection node," he said without preamble as she grabbed his arm. "I found it, Mara. They're storing it. The neurochemical output. They've converted it to something. An energy state, I think. The physics are. It's not our physics. They've been doing this across the sector for 200 years. This isn't their first harvest world. Elias, they have archives, species they're finished with, dozens of them. The emotional signatures are stored in these." He stopped. His jaw was tight. "What?" "They called them wells. That's the closest translation. Wells of experience. They sell access to them. There's an entire Veth economy built on." He stopped again, looked at his hands, looked at her. "We're livestock." "We were livestock," Mara said. Present tense negotiable. She pulled him away from the wall. "You map the collection node. You know where it is." "What?" "The processing unit. The thing that converts neurochemical output into whatever state they store it in. If that unit goes down..." He stared at her for a second. Then she watched him make the same calculation she'd already made, through his mind the way he ran everything. Test it for holes, find none. The expression on his face shifted. "It would corrupt the signal chain," he said slowly. "Any chips already broadcasting, the feedback would go back upstream. Into the node," he thought. "The emotional signatures are stored in a compressed state. If the processing unit received a massive, undifferentiated burst instead of a managed signal, what happens? The system would try to process it. And human emotion isn't." He almost laughed, a broken sound that wasn't quite humor. "Human emotional output at full amplitude is the most complex electrochemical event in the known biosphere. The Veth spent 200 years developing collection technology calibrated to handle it in managed doses, in controlled increments. 231 chips all dumped their full signal simultaneously into an unprepared node. It breaks. It breaks. Feedback through the chips would. He paused. The chips would be fried, rendered inert. Everyone they've harvested so far might actually be okay. He swallowed. Might. Where is the node? Sublevel 2. Central ring. Behind a Veth biometric lock. He looked at her. "Which I cannot open." "I know." Mara reached into the lining of her jacket, where she'd sewn a secondary pocket 3 days ago, and removed a small device the size and shape of a pen. "But I brought something that can." He stared at it. "Is that a shaped charge EMP?" Staff Sergeant in the 75th Rangers doesn't walk into an alien habitat empty-handed, Elias. He stared at her for another moment. Then he started moving, and as he walked, he hummed. That same nameless tune, just a few bars. Low and automatic. The way you'd hum when you were thinking through something hard. She fell into step beside him and found herself humming it too. Sublevel 2 was quieter than the upper floors, which should have been reassuring, and wasn't. The Veth architecture down here had stopped trying to look human. The corridors were wider and taller, and the proportions were wrong in ways that visual cortex kept flagging, and the light was a different color. Something in the blue-violet range that made her skin look like something from a medical textbook. The hum was louder here. She felt it in her back teeth. They passed 2 Veth crew members who looked at them with the sustained, sussing quality of beings that knew something was off, but hadn't yet determined what. Mara smiled and kept walking at a pace that said she belonged here, and beside her Elias did the same. Slightly different bearing, slightly different stride. The unconscious choreography of 2 people who'd spent enough time in foreign environments to know that confidence was a kind of camouflage. The first Veth moved to intercept them at the junction to the central ring. It was taller than the ones upstairs, and the joint configuration of its limbs suggested a different caste. Security, or administration, or something in between. It addressed them in a register that her earpiece translated with a 2-second lag as, "This sector is not authorized for your classification." Mara nodded, the way you nod when an authority figure says something you've entirely expected. "Doctor, car is needed at the processing array for calibration," she said. "We have a collection variance in Unit 7. Sector voice Ulthrin cleared the access. The Veth's sensory clusters rotated. In the 2-second window that followed, Mara watched it calculate probability. She was good at reading calculation, even on faces that weren't human faces. What she saw was low risk, plausible story, defer to authority hierarchy. What she also saw, because she was watching for it, was the thing the Veth did not do, was question why a human medical variance would require a human researcher to fix it rather than a Veth technician. They didn't think of humans as peers. Not even the humans they'd hired, credentialed, given laboratory access and comfortable lighting and calibrated air. Humans were resources. Resources didn't troubleshoot their own processing. That was the miscalculation. That had always been the miscalculation. The Veth stepped aside. The collection node looked, in Mara's immediate assessment, like nothing that should exist. It occupied a chamber the size of a basketball court, and its architecture was organic synthetic, something between a server farm and a living thing. Strips of crystalline material threading through a structure that pulsed with a slow, deep light that had no obvious source. Chip's signal. 231 peoples harvested fear and grief and anguish, ran into it through conduits that were invisible to I, but which Elias could apparently see on his scanner. Because he stopped when they entered and his face did something complicated. The storage wells, he said very quietly. They're full. They've been harvesting this world for 18 months, Mara, before they ever landed. She looked at him. The satellite they sent first, the one we thought was atmospheric mapping. It was a long-range signal probe. We're reading us. From orbit. He turned slowly, scanner tracking across the node architecture. They knew our neurochemistry before they ever introduced themselves. They calibrated the habitat to maximize yield. The light, the air, portion of the doorways. He stopped. The tune. She went still. The ambient tone in the habitat. It's not soothing. His voice was very level. It's a resonant frequency keyed to the limbic system. It increases emotional amplitude without triggering a conscious alarm response. You feel calmer, so you don't fight the feeling. But what you're actually producing is... He looked at her. They piped it in, everywhere, this whole time. Stood in the middle of an alien machine built to squeeze fear out of human nervous systems like juice from a fruit, and she felt, in that moment, not afraid. She felt furious. It was a specific kind of fury. Not the hot, bright kind that burned itself out. The kind that settled in, cold and exact, that said, I am going to take this apart. Not quickly, not easily, but completely. Tell me the exact placement, she said. He pointed. She placed the shape charge EMP at the base of the primary conduit junction. Elias indicated the input cascade converged before distribution to the storage architecture. It took her 40 seconds. She'd practiced the placement of similar devices in similar spaces. Not alien spaces. Improvised explosive in a server room was a skill set that translated. The feedback pulse, Elias said, watching her work. Chips will receive it before they're fried. Whatever the people wearing them are feeling right now, it goes in at full amplitude. Yes. Good. He looked at her. Because I know what they're feeling right now, she said. I know what it feels like to be used. To have something reach into you and take what it wants and call it treatment. Call it help. She armed the device. I know what kind of signal that produces. The thing about the Veth's 200-year harvest program, as Mara understood it in the 2 minutes she had before the charge detonated, was that it was an extraordinary feat of patience and engineering. They had developed, over centuries, a system of breathtaking precision, calibrated to human neurochemistry, matched to human emotional rhythms, careful and measured and controlled. They had not developed it for the version of human emotion that does not want to be measured. The charge blew at 03:14 local time, and the feedback pulse traveled up the signal chain at a speed Elias would later describe. In the paper, he wrote that no journal would publish for 2 years, as consistent with the propagation rate of coherent emotional information through quantum-entangled biological lattice, which was a sentence that meant nothing to anyone except the 12 xenophysicists who read the preprint and immediately demanded to know where he'd gotten his data. What Mara experienced in the moment was simpler and louder. The node screamed, not acoustically, or not only acoustically, but in whatever sense a machine could be said to scream when it was given more than it was built to hold. The crystalline architecture fractured from the conduit junction outward in a pattern that Elias said later looked like a neuron firing under electron microscope magnification. The pulse went through the floor and the walls, and the light changed color, and somewhere above them, in the levels where humans were being kept comfortable enough to be afraid, 231 chips simultaneously received a signal that was not the Veth's controlled extraction frequency, but the full amplitude, uncompressed output of 231 human beings who were lost and sick and missing their families, and furious that something had used their pain as currency. The Veth systems were not built for that. Elias had estimated the processing node would fail. What he had not estimated, because he was an honest scientist and the data wasn't available, was how the failure would propagate. The answer, it turned out, was every connected system simultaneously and without discrimination. The way a power surge propagates through a grid, except the grid in question was the Veth ship's harvest management infrastructure. And the surge in question was the distilled electrochemical, signature of human grief and rage, running at frequencies the Veth equivalent of engineers had apparently never modeled, because in 200 years of harvesting, they had never lost control of a collection event. They had never dealt with a species that treated its own fear as a weapon. Mara and Elias ran. Behind them, the chamber was coming apart in a way that was more beautiful than it should have been. The crystalline storage wells fracturing and releasing their contents in cascades of light that corresponded, Elias said breathlessly as they sprinted, to the frequency signatures of the species they'd been storing. Centuries of harvested fear and anguish from a dozen worlds, all of it finally loose, none of it theirs to hold anymore. The habitat's upper levels were chaos in the way that chaos looks when a very orderly system encounters something it cannot categorize. The Veth moved in rapid, tight patterns that in other contexts would have looked like crisis response, and in this context, looked like confusion, the ambient tone, the limbic frequency hum, cut out between one heartbeat and the next, and the air felt different without it, rawer and colder and more honest. They hit the exterior gate at a run. The lock was down. Mara went over it the way she'd gone over obstacles in Montana and Kandahar, and one memorable afternoon in a training facility in Stuttgart that she still wasn't allowed to fully describe. And Elias, who she would not have guessed was a man who could clear a security barrier, went over it 2 seconds later, with an efficiency that suggested the adrenaline was handling the logistics. Outside was Nevada night, cold and enormous, and smelling of alkaline dust and distance. The stars were the same stars. The mountain ridgeline was the same ridgeline. 50 meters out, they stopped running. Not because they were safe. She didn't know if they were safe. But because there are moments when your legs simply make a decision and the rest of you accepts it. Mara bent forward, hands on her knees, breathing. Elias stood upright, which she respected, and looked back at the habitat dome. It was dark in ways it hadn't been before. Interior lights failing sector by sector, the white exterior surface going from luminous to the flat, indifferent gray of inert material. She straightened, keyed her radio. Fies Kessler, this is Voss. You need to spin up your medical teams. Now. All of them. We have 231 people inside that thing who are going to need real help. She paused. Human help. Static. Then Osi's voice clipped in a wake, because Harlan Osi was the kind of man who slept at his desk on nights that mattered. Voss report. Collection node is down. Signal chain is severed. The chips should be inert. She looked at the dome. And the Veth ship upstairs just had its harvest infrastructure take a full amplitude dump of undifferentiated human neurochemical output. A longer pause. What does that mean for the ship? She looked at Elias. He looked at his scanner, which was still processing, and his expression was the expression of a scientist who has encountered data he did not expect, and is trying to decide whether it's a miracle or a problem or both simultaneously, he said. The ship's drive system draws from the same power architecture as the collection node. They built it that way. Harvest output feeds propulsion. Efficient. He turned the scanner over in his hands. It's no longer efficient. They're not going anywhere, Mara said into the radio. Another pause. When Osi spoke again, something in his voice had shifted. Not quite relief. Not quite pride. Something between the two that senior officers sometimes reached on the far side of an impossible night. Get clear of the perimeter. Send. Sir. She looked at the habitat, the people inside. Some of them went in voluntarily, some of them were desperate, some of them were dying. She watched a light go out in the northern wing, and another, and another. They're going to need someone to explain what happened to them. Someone who's been inside. She didn't have to say the rest. O.C. was a precise man. He understood implication. I'll have a trauma team and a liaison unit at your position in 20 minutes. Thank you, sir. She clicked off the radio, stood in the cold Nevada dark. Elias was still looking at his scanner, humming, running numbers. Your mother's song, she said. He looked up. What is it, do you know? He thought about it. She said her mother sang it, and her mother before that. He paused. Something about a river. Something about being too stubborn to drown. He looked back at the dome. I don't think there's a written version. I think it's just something that gets passed down because it fits. Mace listened to the Nevada wind moving through the alkaline flats. 40 meters away, an alien machine that had been built to extract the worst of human experience was dark and failing and going nowhere. 231 people, who had walked into a beautiful place looking for help, were about to walk back out of it into a cold, clear night, the full and complicated truth waiting for them, which was hard and necessary and real. She thought about the Veth, up in their ship, trying to process what had just happened. She thought about the 200-year model they'd built, the patience of it, the precision, the extraordinary engineering required to harvest fear in carefully managed increments from a species that produced it in unmanageable quantities. She thought about the fundamental error at the center of it. You could calibrate for human fear. You could map it, measure it, collect it in controlled doses. But fear was not the fundamental thing. Fear was the surface of something deeper, and the thing underneath it. The particular human stubbornness that turned grief into action and loss, into a reason to move toward the problem, rather than away from it. That was not something you could harvest. It was not something that could be stored in a well and sold. It was something that had to be given free or not at all, and humans had been the one species in 200 years that did not give it. Elias stopped humming. He'd finished his calculation. Well, she said, they'll have emergency propulsion. Nothing like what they expected to leave with. He pocketed the scanner. The harvest architecture is gone. Whatever they came for, they're not getting it. Good. He looked at her sidelong. You know this isn't over. They came from somewhere. Report back. Others will come. I know, and next time we'll know what to look for. She turned to face the ridgeline, where the lights of the firebase were already moving, trucks and medics, and the organized urgency of people who knew their job. Calibrated light, calibrated air, a hum below conscious hearing, a place that looks like everything you want. She exhaled, self-sufficient, walkable, everything within reach. He was quiet. They built it to be perfect, she said. That's how you knew it wasn't. He thought about that. Then he started humming again, very quietly, something about a river, something about being too stubborn to drown. And she fell into step beside him toward the incoming lights and hummed the same melody and found that it fit the rhythm of walking, the rhythm of moving towards something instead of away, which was the most human rhythm there was. 40 meters behind them, the last light in the habitat dome went out. In orbit, the Vithara sat with its harvest drives, silent, and its storage wells empty, and its 200-year enterprise suddenly, completely, irretrievably done. And if the beings aboard it were capable of the humans would call humility, this was the moment they were learning it. They had built the perfect trap. They had studied their prey for 18 months and 200 years, and across a dozen worlds. They had calibrated everything. They had not calibrated for the species that treats its own suffering as raw material for something other than surrender. They had not calibrated for humans. They had not calibrated for the fact that when you try to farm fear from a creature that has spent its entire evolutionary history refusing to stay afraid, you are not harvesting a resource, you are making an enemy. And the Veth, ascending toward the cold between stars, with their empty wells and their broken drives, and the memory of 231 neurochemical signals slamming into their systems at full amplitude, were only just beginning to understand what that meant.